We will get started here with this. A panel is not really what it is. It's a dialogue, very informal dialogue where we're having a discussion on how to find things, what's going on in your environment. And for that, I have Martin from Mnemonic in Norway, and he did a presentation yesterday about this topic. For this discussion, as it was for yesterday, you do a presentation of a case that you were involved in. Of course, you have NDAs and there's a lot of sensitive things that he cannot answer. So we ask you to respect that some things will not be answered for the specifics. So if you want to have a question, maybe you can think about it in the more general terms, then it will be much more easy to answer. So we have prepared a number of questions, and we will have them, but the floor is open for questions as well. So do you want to say something before we start?
No, not really.
Okay, so then we kick off right away. So it was a very interesting discussion yesterday, or presentation yesterday, and you had a lot of statistics and data that you have shown there. So when you have went through all this is one case of course many that you have been involved in. Is there any experiences that you want to go into, or more? What would you have done different, or what would you have thought about in a different way if you had known that at the beginning of this investigation?
Yeah, there are several things. We learned a lot, and generally, when you go into an incident response assignment, it's very, very important to make sure that you have the necessary skills or skill sets, that you have the resources you need, and that you manage to get help if necessary. It's very important to have management support for what you're doing, especially if this is something which will go on for a long time. Let's try to remember the last.
But getting back to management support, I assume there's a lot of things to that. Could you
give
something about it?
It's just a couple more points I remember now. Make sure that you have the ability to scale up. If you start an assignment with 2 or 3 people, and then sometime down the road you realize that this is bigger, we need to scale up. We need a team of 10 people. How will you organize it? Have you thought about that in advance? What are the roles, responsibilities of the different team members and so forth? And last but not least, documentation. Make sure to document everything in a structured manner from the beginning. Otherwise, if this is something which goes on over a long time period, you're going to be sitting there with a huge mess or a pile of documentation that's difficult to use.
Comprehend.
Yeah.
I was really impressed with some of the documentations from the ISSP people. This timeline that goes on forever, and this was affected at this time and so on. So that is the type of thing you're speaking about, right?
Yes, and also we talked a lot about TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures. Yeah. And one thing I would have done differently is to document those in a structured way from the get-go. Problem with that is, well, you had MITRE ATT&CK, who define tactics and techniques, but there are no commonly agreed upon definitions of procedures. So we basically had to make that ourselves. But going into something like that in the future, I would use that from the get-go. Try to identify the procedures and do it in a structured way.
That's really, really good advices. Getting back to what you say about management buy-in, what type of thing do you think about that? Is it that you have enough resources, or that they are prepared to make sensitive decisions in a lack of time and things like that?
I think it's very, very important that management understands what you are doing and why you are doing it. Of course, not all the technical details. I like trying to compare things with reports that are out in the open, publicly available, because there's no restrictions on talking about that. And one good example is the Office of Personnel Management breach in the US, OPM. Everyone heard of the OPM hack? Yeah.
Just do a quick review of it, so people know it.
Quick review is that I think it was the US CERT that notified the OPM that they were breached.
I heard a story that there was a vendor on site that's going to show off their new
product.
Yeah. So they, oh look, this is a whiz-bang expensive thing that threat.
And then they just went haywire.
Oh, this looks like something happening here right now.
Yeah. But they got help from the US CERT. And they tried to assess the scope of the breach, find all endpoints that were infected, and then at some point, because the attacker was getting a bit too close to where they didn't want them to be, they decided on an eviction strategy. And they set a date for where they were going to evict them. And they did that. And they successfully managed to evict the attacker. However, there was a second attacker in the network, and attribution-wise, attacker 1 and 2 were, according to public reports, from the same country, but working in parallel. So attacker 2 was in there, still had access, just laid low for a long time, then got back in and stole lots and lots of sensitive documents. And they got their hands on the forms that you have to fill out to get a security clearance in the US.
And there was like tens of millions of these.
Maybe not tens of millions, but it's, I mean...
I've heard figures like 25 millions.
Yeah, okay, but the damage might take generations to fix. Yeah. So it had a huge impact, and the root cause was that they did not successfully assess the full scope. They did not realize that there were actually 2 attackers in there. So they thought they knew about everything and decided to evict, and then thought they were done, and then the really big damage happened afterwards.
I think you touched on one of my favorite topics, assumptions. Assumption is the mother of all fuck-ups, right?
Yeah, and that's a very good point, because that's also important learning, that if you want to do attribution, you don't have to do attribution, but I think it's at least useful to try to group activity together that says that this threat actor, you don't need to say where they're from or if they're state-sponsored or not.
There are similar modes of operation.
Yeah, you group activity together, but then make sure that you do that based on evidence.
Not
don't
assumptions.
Assume. I've done a couple of mistakes there through the years, and it can be quite messy to try to resolve things when you realize that you've misattributed something. It's much easier to be very conservative about attribution. Do not attribute unless you have strong evidence supporting it, so you just document it as 2 separate activity trails. And if and when you get that link, you can link them together. That's a whole lot easier than having one activity trail and then going back and trying to figure out, okay, what was attacker 1 and what was attacker 2.
Not speaking about the specifics on the case you were referring to yesterday, but from a more general sense, what would be your advice to people in the audience about what is good sources for information when they want to do something like you did? What type of technical things, what security features or functions would you say that you should have in place?
Yeah, grab all the threat intel you can, both OSINT and if you have if you're buying feeds, and try to structure it and put it all together in one system. But on data sources, I mean, I haven't seen any incident response assignment where we thought that we went in there and we saw that, oh, we have all the logs we need. That never happens.
So you're saying you can never have too many logs? Too much log. You could always have one more log.
Yeah. You can always have one more log. Yeah. But the thing there is, it's so much more valuable if you start collecting those in advance, not when the incident happens. And you have log retention, so you can actually go back in time and see what happened a year ago. But having endpoint visibility, we mentioned that in the presentation, seeing what's going on the clients, that's a game changer. If you don't have endpoint visibility, your job will be a lot harder. And then, of course, full packet capture is incredibly useful, but can also be incredibly expensive if you have a lot of traffic in your network. But storing that at least for some period of time is very valuable.
So you get some reference point, like this happened, and then you could go back into the full package capture and see what other things happen around the same time.
And having things like, NetFlow is one way to aggregate who talked to who. So you don't get the level of detail that you would get from a full packet capture, but at least you can be able to track activity across the network. So you have network data sources, endpoint data sources. Of course, you have stuff like logs from domain controllers, firewall logs, proxy logs,
And then just do a lot of data crunching.
Yeah, and correlation. If you have a CM, use it. Try to normalize, try to correlate all of these data sources to get the whole picture. It's not easy, but it's necessary.
Yeah.
Yep.
I suppose you spent man years in your company just to analyze this attack to some distance. You said it took you half a year. I suppose it's many thousands of hours work.
That would be yes.
Yeah. Did your customer take a long time to get the decision of spending those money on?
I don't really want to talk about the specifics, but
did that result in that you got fewer logs and so on? Because you were asked to work too late. I mean, the decision to hire you, was it so fast that you didn't use information?
Yeah, I don't think I'm at liberty to talk too much about that decision and the particulars.
Maybe you could speak more about Joe. You said that you had handled other cases.
Yeah, we've handled other cases.
Is that a problem?
The general.
Decision-making at the customer's side.
Yeah. One general problem is preparedness. Do you actually have the logs? Have you switched on logging? Do you have the necessary data to do that kind of analysis? And the second one is how long does it take until the incident is discovered? And compare that to your log retention policy. If you have a log retention policy that you keep the most important logs for 1 year, and it turns out the initial breach happened more than a year ago, then you will most likely not be able to find the initial infection vector. So yes, that's an issue, but I think the main problem there is the time from breach to detection, not necessarily the logistics around hiring and that kind of thing. So it's about early detection. If you can detect early, then you stand a much better chance of understanding the whole compromise.
I can try to make a comment on this because I don't have an NDA with whoever it is, and I don't know whatever entity it is. But I assume that because you actually have the data that you had, that there was some level of maturity at that organization. So if there was some random other organization and they were up in the same situation, you would not have this number of logs or being able to extract all these commands and things like that because they weren't there. That's my experience when doing incident response, because you go in and you start to ask them for things and they said,
are the managers prepared to pay this logs?
It really depends on the situation.
Also, this would be the whole closer would be to their actual business.
Yeah.
The closer it is to business, and then after the initial, if you have a sort of a breach, and then final breach, and it's sort of very close to sort of course, it would be easy to get more easy than if you didn't have it.
And also if it's close to some of their biggest clients, their customers and so on. I can just comment on the thing with Logica, which I was involved in 2012. It involved the Swedish National Police, the Enforcement Agency, the tax authority and so on. They were big clients to this company, and there was this big thing going on, so they had the highest visibility for the management. And then there wasn't any big problems to spending resources on it. But if it was just some random thing in a corner, it will be probably just handled like any other incident.
But I think we're kind of circling around the question of when should you do eviction?
Yeah.
And
how to keep the coolness and try to continue on and through the analysis.
Yeah, and one very important factor there is knowledge. That you know about previous cases, you know maybe not which specific attacker is targeting you, but the kind of threat profile of that attacker, their capabilities, their resource levels, their how persistent they are. Are they just out to compromise someone, or are they after you specifically? And once you know that, I mentioned OPM, but in one of the previous presentations today, they talked about sleeper
agent or
sleeper agents. We talked about deep implants. It's more or less the same thing. It means that the attacker has deployed something that they don't use until they lose their primary means of access. So it's just there to ensure that they're able to get back in. And you have things like Kerberos golden tickets that can be used to escalate privileges once they get that initial foothold back. And if you evict too early, until you've assessed the scope, then you run the risk of them getting immediately back into your infrastructure, and you might lose visibility on what they're doing. So it's about first understanding the scope. Second, gathering as much knowledge as you can about the attacker, not only their infrastructure and indicators, because that will most likely change when you evict them and they come back, but how they operate and how you're able to detect them, so that you can be fairly confident that if they attack you again, you will detect them early and be able to stop that before they get a proper foothold. Okay. And I assume you're familiar with the cyber kill chain from Lockheed Martin. I don't know if all of you read the paper from Lockheed Martin, but they have one of the core points in that paper is how you should use the cyber kill chain. If you detect an attack at in the command and control phase of the kill chain, you should try to analyze your way back to figure out the previous steps, and then you should make sure that you're able to detect each of those steps. And that's fairly intuitive, and I think most people try to do that. But the opposite is also true. If you detect and stop an attack at the delivery phase, you should synthesize the rest of the kill chain. You should try to download the next stage payload and the next stage payload, see what it does, maybe start a honeypot, see if you can attract them. And see if you then try to detect all the later stages in the kill chain. And you do this per threat actor, so you have a more robust detection, because they might change some things for the next attempt, but if you're able to detect them at all stages in the kill chain, then you have a much better chance of stopping them.
That is really good advice, actually.
That's advice from Lockheed Martin. It's literally in
but
their
also
paper.
for this audience.
Yeah.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think that we will start in the main hall in just a couple of minutes. So if anyone has any more questions to Martin, please grab in during one of the breaks. So.
Well, when we do log analysis, I think the bare minimum we do is firewall logs, and preferably correlate that with an IDS.
What is the parameters in would you like to have? What is kind of top of the issues? This is what I want to have before I start my analysis.
With that kind of, if you have an advanced persistent threat and you want to stop them, I would say that you should definitely have endpoint visibility. See process execution on the endpoints, command line. in endpoints and log that to a centralized SIEM. And you need network visibility, preferably an IDS with the ability to roll out custom signatures if you need. Firewall, NetFlow logs to see who talked to who. There's no fixed answer to that, but you can see that one very important point is that having visibility on the endpoint is really a game changer when responding to advanced threats.
System logs.
If you don't have that, then you're in trouble. It's very, very difficult to keep track of them if you can't actually see what's going on out on the endpoints.
I think we have to save that for later because I have already started in there. So, but please talk to Martin at some other break. Yeah.